Hello out there, welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. Together we're going through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year, a little bit every day. Today we're going to be reading Genesis 44:18 through 30. And I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation, and then we can discuss what it is that we have read. So let's go ahead and get started. And Judah approached him and said, Please, my lord, let your servant speak a word in my lord's hearing, and let your wrath not flare against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh. My lord has asked his servant, saying, Do you have a father or brother? And we said to my lord, We have an aged father and a young child of his old age, and his brother being dead, he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him. And you said to your servants, Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my lord, The lad cannot leave his father. Should he leave his father, he would die. And you said to your servants, If your youngest brother does not come down with you, you shall not see my face again. And it happened, when we went up to your servant, my father, that we told him the words of my lord. And our father said, Go back, buy us some food. And we said, We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, we shall go down. For we cannot see the face of the man if our youngest brother is not with us. And your servant, our father, said to us, You know that two did my wife bear me, and one went out from me, and I thought, Oh, he's been torn to shreds, and I have not seen him since. And should you take this one too from my presence, and harm befall him, you would bring down my gray head and evil to Sheol. And so, should I come to your servant, my father, and the lad be not with us, for his life is bound to the lad's. Is that really where it ends? Hold on. Yep. That's weird. It's right in the middle of a thought. Hold on. Yep. Okay. Just kind of an interesting choice there. It ends in the middle of that thought. So, we have the initial approach here by Judah in order to try to deal with this situation.
Excuse me.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of a weird cliffhanger to end on, but we have the beginning of what Judah is doing in order to try to basically solve the situation. All right, and he still at this point, of course, doesn't know who Joseph is. So, what are some of the thoughts that come to you when you hear this?
Well, here are the two pillars in a way of the future nation. We have Joseph had the birthright, and Judah ultimately has the scepter. And here Judah had taken responsibility for Benjamin, and now he steps forward, and as we'll see, he's going to handle the situation in such a way that Joseph will be moved to ultimate. Well, all right, I guess I won't give it away.
Spoilers.
But I was going to comment on something prior to this. Joseph was testing them in various ways. I'm not necessarily justifying his approach, but one thing he did was he showered benefits on Benjamin, as I recall,
Mm-hmm.
and so
That he gave him more
to see if they would be
food.
jealous of Benjamin the way they
Right.
were of him,
Right.
and evidently here he saw that they had overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
It's also interesting that Judah took the trouble to quote his dad saying something that Judah knew to be false, that they had concocted, they had given him this evidence, quote unquote, so that he could come to that conclusion. And he just quotes his father as saying that, it's kind of interesting that why he did that.
Right.
Now, later on, you'll see that they did assume that Joseph was dead, and that's evidently because they hadn't heard from him in all that time. They probably figured if he were alive, he'd figure out some way to get word back to us. So they even took him for dead, evidently. So
well, yeah, because he says,
later on,
Judah here he says, and we said, We have an aged father and a young child of his old age, and his brother being dead.
Oh, he already. Okay, that's
So Judah is basically seems to think he's dead. I don't think he's being dishonest. At this point, it seems like
no.
he's being as honest as possible. So
Yes,
at this point, you get the idea that Judah does assume he's probably dead.
and so there always remains that question about Joseph and why he didn't get word back to his dad when he, especially after he became so prominent.
Hmm.
Uh, and my concept is that maybe he somehow blamed his father for some of what had happened. Possibly uh, is what I would say, but. I would also like to say something else about Joseph,
Uh huh.
a pattern that you see in Joseph. Jacob is alive and he's the patriarch, but he makes Joseph, in effect, the future leader of the group. He makes him special, and assumedly, even though he's so young, but yet he seems to be the future leader based upon how he's being treated. But
Right.
of course, he remains under his dad.
Right.
Then he goes to the prison to Potiphar's house. Potiphar is clearly in charge, but he's got all power other than under Potiphar. So Potiphar is the main person, but he's got all this power under Potiphar. Then he goes to the prison, and he becomes the next in charge under the warden. So he's a prisoner, and yet he's second in command under the warden. And then he goes to the court of Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh's in charge, but he's got all the power other than being Pharaoh.
Right.
It's just a pattern you see all through there. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. It is interesting how he starts it out because he says, "For you are like Pharaoh," because he doesn't think he is, but yet he's trying to appeal to whatever power level he's at that point in time. But on the other hand, he can't say that he is, obviously, because that would create political people too. So
Yeah,
he's balancing a very fine line of how to handle that.
it does seem that one of the cultural characteristics that you have in Jews is a certain a way with words, a certain
Hmm.
eloquence. They tend to be to gravitate towards many of the professions of where people can be persuaded and worked with words. It goes all the way back to their father Judah. That's part of. I mean, Levi is a part of it as well, of course.
Yeah, what's interesting is when he recounts what Jacob is saying. He said, he went out for me, and I thought, oh, he's been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. Which that's a little bit different than the way it comes across before. There's a little more doubt there. I feel like, because it's I have not seen him since gives you the impression that he still was kind of maybe holding out hope that somehow he survived the attack, or there was more information, or something like that. Because you wouldn't say, I haven't seen them since if you're like 100% sure that the person died. So it does show you there was doubt there with Jacob.
That's a good point. Um, as I recall, a Rashi. I didn't check it out before this podcast, but there was a Rashi where when he says you're like Pharaoh, that there was kind of an implied negativism there too.
Mm.
Uh, you know,
Yeah, it
uh,
goes both ways,
it
right?
goes. Yeah, I think that's how.
He's
I,
dealing with them shrewdly. Is that kind of the idea?
yeah,
Yeah.
at this point, I wouldn't think though he'd want to be negative in any way. You
No.
see how respectful he is.
Yeah, that seems really
It's just
dangerous.
like when Abraham was negotiating with God, he was so
Right.
careful how he worded things. Speaking of Rashi, though, I wanted to go back, if I might, to an way earlier passage, the beginning of this whole episode, back in Genesis 37, um, just for a moment,
Sure.
because I said that I was going to talk about the extraordinary points as they come up, and there's once and again an example of a pointed word in Genesis 37:12. So it says, "Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem,"
Hmm.
and there's a two-letter word in the Hebrew language that has a grammatical function. It precedes a definite direct object, like I study the law.
Okay.
So I study the law would be preceded by this two-letter word
Hmm.
that is normally in modern Hebrew pronounced et. sometimes when people read the Torah, they pronounce it eight, depending on the accentuation, et or eight. Well, anyway, so that word, of course, precedes their father's flock, you know, and the brothers went to feed et their father's flock. Okay, so that word is pointed. So the tradition among the Jews is they went to feed their father's flock. You know, ironically, that really they went to feed themselves, and so I guess the concept is that they were more concerned with their own profit rather than with their fathers.
Hmm.
That seems that's the Jewish tradition on this sentence, and I just want there's possibly textual critics have other points they would bring out, but that's at least the Jewish tradition on it.
Interesting.
So now to get back to the passage we're in, I'll I'll pass the torch back to my son.
Well, I mean, it just is interesting that they left it here, and I think it might be to some degree this where it's at the very end. They want to draw attention to that, and you could maybe even maybe be a little bit critical of that, but I think one of the reasons why they traditionally stop it here is the idea of the father and his life is bound to the son, and they just really want to emphasize that. And I think that might be overemphasized, and sometimes in Judaism they can get a little mystical about things like that. But I mean, it is actually a profound statement in many ways if you think about it from a Christology standpoint and things like that. So
Ah,
I don't want to rule out the necessity of potentially highlighting that key phrase. So I'm going to give them some credit to point out that key phrase and not just get too critical of Kabbalah sort of stuff.
sometimes it seems that the rabbinic tradition winds up doing things that are actually quite Christological,
Hmm.
not deliberately,
Well,
but almost as
I
if.
mean, if you're biblically
Mhm.
minded, you can't help it,
Well,
right?
that's a point.
Yeah.
I wanted to make a comment. I would recommend if you're trying to harmonize secular history with scripture. I'm a David Rohl fan, although I'm not that really conversant with his material, but I know something of what he's done.
You have a poster in your
And
living
it
room,
was,
but
evidently he believes this pharaoh that we're talking about here is Amenemhat the Third. So if you want to look up Amenemhat the Third,
a meta hat,
Amenem Amenemhat
a
the
menem
Third,
hat. I
Amenemhat the
love a
Third,
menem hats. They're like they're right there with baseball caps.
Amenemhat the Third. But anyway, the point is that at this time there was very severe flooding now in
Mm,
Egypt, so that they couldn't really plant for the next season.
mm.
And I know a scholar who was my teacher, who has died, but a very close friend and a scholar who taught me. He went along with David Rule here, and the idea that there were periods when there was such bad flooding they couldn't plant for the next year, and that would be a partial explanation for the famine.
It also would be an explanation of the dream where the cows are coming
The river,
from the
yeah,
river.
that's a good
So
point.
that's kind of interesting
That's a
too.
good point.
That kind of ties together.
That's a good
I
point.
do think that's a good point though, because whenever you see this portrayed in film or something, they always make famine out to be like the Dust Bowl situation of the
Yeah,
Depression, and that's not the only type of famines there are. So
yeah,
it's just helpful to have that in your mind
yeah.
that there's other possibilities. Don't get too hung up on that because then even in terms of the symbolism things like that, like for example what I pointed out with the cows coming out of the river, you might have missed that that's a potential possibility if you're just too narrow on
Right,
what you think a famine is. All
right.
right, any other thoughts? I know we're kind of in the middle of a thought here, so
Let's press on.
yes, we better press on, and we will see you tomorrow.